Spirit possession. Spirit possession was a ritual framework in which a person was believed to temporarily host a divine or spiritual presence. It existed in religious systems where the boundary between human and sacred was understood as permeable rather than fixed. Possession was not random. It was carefully prepared through music, posture, rhythm, or sacred space. The possessed individual functioned as a vessel, not an authority. Socially, the ritual allowed communities to receive guidance, warning, or reassurance without permanent hierarchy. The message was valued more than the messenger. Symbolically, possession expressed closeness between the divine and human worlds. The sacred was not distant but active and present. Over time, these rituals declined or transformed as religious systems emphasized stable texts, trained leadership, and moral instruction over ecstatic experience. Authority shifted from embodied moments to written tradition and ethical teaching. Political and institutional structures also discouraged unpredictable expressions of sacred power. What remained was the idea of inspiration, preserved in language describing guidance or influence without loss of personal control. Ritual purification. Ritual purification involves structured actions meant to restore a person or community to a state considered spiritually clean. It arose in religious systems where impurity was understood as a disruption of sacred order rather than a moral failure. Contact with death, illness, blood, or certain life events created imbalance that required correction. Purification rituals followed clear rules. They often involved washing, waiting periods, symbolic actions, or prescribed words. Socially, these rituals maintained boundaries. They regulated participation in communal life and reinforced shared definitions of order and disorder. Symbolically, purification marked transition. It allowed movement from one state of life to another without threatening the sacred structure of the community. Over time, many of these rituals disappeared or changed as religious systems shifted emphasis from external states to internal intention. Purity became associated with ethical behavior and conscience rather than physical condition. Advances in medical understanding also altered views of contamination. What remained was the language of cleansing, preserved in metaphor and symbolic acts that no longer functioned as strict ritual requirements. Sacred regicide. Sacred regicide was a ritual in which a ruler was killed to restore or renew cosmic balance. It emerged in societies where kingship was understood as a sacred function rather than a permanent office. The ruler embodied the health of the land, the people, and the divine order. When prosperity failed, the king's death was believed necessary for renewal. The ritual followed fixed traditions and was often symbolic rather than impulsive. Socially, it limited absolute power. No ruler stood above the cosmic law. Symbolically, the act represented death and rebirth at the level of the state. The old order ended so a new one could begin. Over time, sacred regicide disappeared as political authority separated from divine embodiment. Kingship became legal rather than ritual. Succession replaced sacrifice. Ethical frameworks and centralized governance removed ritual killing from leadership transition. What remained was symbolic language about renewal and accountability, preserved without the destruction of the ruler. Divination sacrifice. Divination sacrifice was a ritual in which an offering was made to obtain knowledge believed to be hidden from ordinary human perception. It existed in worldviews where the future was governed by divine intention rather than chance. Sacrifice created a moment of access. The offering signaled seriousness and respect toward the sacred forces believed to control outcomes. The ritual followed formal procedures, often involving inspection, interpretation, or signs believed to reveal meaning. Socially, divination sacrifice provided direction. Leaders and communities used it to justify decisions, reduce uncertainty, and maintain order. Symbolically, the act acknowledged human limitation. Knowledge was not seized but requested. Over time, these rituals declined as religious systems shifted toward moral reasoning, written law, and ethical teaching rather than predictive revelation. Authority moved from ritual specialists to texts and institutions. Advances in governance also reduced dependence on divine forecasting. What remained was the language of discernment, preserved in reflective practices rather than sacrificial inquiry. Ritual renewal. Ritual renewal was a ceremonial act intended to restore sacred order when it was believed to have weakened over time. It emerged in religious systems where the world was understood as fragile and subject to gradual decay. Sacred space, social bonds, and divine favor required periodic restoration. These rituals were often tied to cycles of time, such as years, reigns, or cosmic calendars. The act of renewal symbolized a return to an original state of balance. Socially, ritual renewal reinforced continuity. It reminded communities that stability depended on collective participation and remembrance. Leaders, priests, and ordinary members all had defined roles within the process. Symbolically, the ritual erased accumulated disorder without denying its existence. Renewal did not deny failure but addressed it through structured repetition. Over time, these rituals declined as religious systems shifted toward linear views of history rather than cyclical repetition. Moral reform and personal responsibility replaced ceremonial reset. Political institutions also assumed roles once held by sacred renewal rites. What remained was the concept of renewal itself, preserved in symbolic language, commemorations, and moments of reflection rather than formal ritual reconstruction. Cosmic rites. Cosmic rites were rituals intended to sustain or reenact the structure of the universe as a sacred order. They emerged in worldviews where creation was not a finished event but an ongoing process that required human participation. Disorder was believed to increase naturally over time. Ritual action restored balance. These rites often reenacted myths of creation, conflict, or renewal through words, movement, or symbolic acts. Socially, cosmic rites placed the community within a larger story. Human life was framed as meaningful because it echoed divine patterns. Participation reinforced shared identity and purpose. Symbolically, the ritual collapsed time. The past act of creation was made present so the world could continue. Over time, these rites declined as religious systems shifted toward ethical responsibility and historical progression rather than ritual maintenance of the cosmos. Creation became understood as sustained by divine will alone, not repeated human action. Political and intellectual changes also reduced mythic frameworks that supported cosmic reenactment. What remained was symbolic storytelling. Creation myths continued to shape meaning, but ritual reenactment gave way to teaching, reflection, and moral imagination. Violent exorcism. Violent exorcism was a ritual in which physical force was used to expel a spirit believed to be causing illness, disorder, or misfortune. It existed in worldviews where the body was seen as vulnerable to invasion by external powers. Suffering was interpreted as evidence of presence rather than pathology. The ritual followed established patterns and was often conducted by recognized specialists. Socially, it reassured the community that disorder could be confronted and contained. The afflicted person was treated as a site of conflict rather than as a moral failure. Symbolically, the struggle enacted a visible battle between order and chaos. Force demonstrated authority over the unseen. Over time, these rituals declined as religious systems redefined evil as moral rather than invasive, and as understanding of illness changed. Healing shifted toward care and instruction instead of confrontation. Legal and ethical standards also restricted physical coercion. What remained was the language of liberation and restoration, preserved in symbolic prayer and ritual words rather than bodily violence. Trial ordeal. Trial ordeal was a ritual method of judgment in which guilt or innocence was believed to be revealed through physical testing. It emerged in societies where divine justice was thought to operate directly within the material world. Fire, water, or pain functioned as instruments through which the sacred revealed truth. The ritual followed formal rules and was overseen by recognized authorities. Socially, trial ordeal resolved conflict when evidence or testimony was limited. It transferred responsibility for judgment from human decision to divine action. Symbolically, the ordeal expressed trust in a moral universe where truth could not remain hidden. Survival or endurance signaled favor. Over time, these rituals disappeared as legal systems developed procedures based on testimony, investigation, and evidence. Justice became institutional rather than ritual. Religious thought also shifted toward ethical accountability rather than immediate divine intervention. Political authority reinforced uniform legal standards. What remained was the language of testing and judgment, preserved metaphorically without physical danger or ritualized suffering. Weather rites. Weather rites were rituals intended to influence rain, sun, wind, or storms believed to be governed by divine forces. They emerged in societies where survival depended directly on environmental stability and where natural events appeared responsive to sacred will. Drought, flood, or prolonged cold threatened not only crops but social order. Ritual action was understood as a form of participation in cosmic negotiation. These rites followed seasonal timing and communal involvement. Socially, they unified the community around shared vulnerability and collective hope. Everyone depended on the outcome. Symbolically, the ritual acknowledged human limitation. Nature was powerful but not impersonal. It could be addressed, petitioned, or appeased. Over time, weather rites declined as religious systems separated divine intention from immediate natural control. Scientific observation and agricultural planning reduced ritual dependence. Religious meaning shifted toward trust rather than manipulation. Political organization also replaced ritual leadership during crisis. What remained was symbolic language of blessing and providence, preserved without the expectation of direct ritual control over the sky. Sacred silence. Sacred silence was a ritual practice in which speech, sound, or sensory input was intentionally withdrawn to create space for the sacred. It developed in religious systems where truth was believed to emerge through stillness rather than expression. Silence was not absence. It was an active discipline. Participants entered silence for defined periods, often within sacred spaces or during transitional moments. Socially, the ritual created equality. Rank, argument, and persuasion were suspended. All participants submitted to the same restraint. Symbolically, silence acknowledged the limits of language. The sacred was understood as something encountered, not explained. Over time, formal rituals of enforced silence declined as religious systems emphasized teaching, proclamation, and communal instruction. Authority shifted towards spoken texts and shared interpretation rather than inward withdrawal. Cultural changes also reduced tolerance for extended silence within public religious life. What remained was the symbolic value of silence itself. It survived as a voluntary discipline, a moment of reflection, or a gesture of reverence, preserved without strict ritual obligation or communal enforcement. If these extinct rituals raised questions about how ancient people understood order, fear, and the sacred, the story does not end here. We will continue with the remaining rituals in another episode, examining how they functioned, how communities used them to face uncertainty, justice, nature, and silence, and why those practices eventually disappeared.